Hi, welcome back to the Crafts channel. My name's Corinne Brad, and if you've watched a couple of previous videos, I've shown you how to make a simple block quilt and then how to top stitch or quilt your simple block quilt. This is obviously not a full-size bed quilt, but it would make a great dolly's bed, or actually it's going to make a nice mat for my sewing machine. So all I've done is, after I've top stitched it, is I have trimmed the lining and the backing to the same size as the quilt top, and I have just run a zigzag stitch all around the edge just to hold these pieces together quickly while I bind it. Now, most bias binding that you buy is called bias binding because it's cut on the bias, and what it does is it stretches, so you can go around curves. You can make your own binding, and it doesn't have to be bias binding. You can cut your own binding from fabric along the grain. These are 3 centimetres wide, these pieces. And then you can simply join them together end to end, diagonally, to make your own binding. So I'll show you quickly how you do that. And it is very easy. If you just take your binding like this, pop a second piece face down over it at a right angle, and then run from corner to corner using a straight stitch. Done that completely wrong. You know when you look at it and think, hang on a minute, which button I've got? You don't go from that corner to that corner. You go from this corner to this corner. So that, yeah, I'll show you. So you go from the junction, the side of the junction. Because what you need to do is you simply need to snip that piece off. And if I'd run it the other way, you wouldn't have been able to snip it off. And then fold it out like so. I'm going to show you that again just to make sure that I know what I'm doing and you know what I'm doing. So lay one piece over the other at a right angle, pop a pin in it, and run from that junction to that junction. And snip off the excess. Now you can of course just join them end to end on a straight line, but the advantage of doing it diagonally is when you use this to bind a quilt, when you fold it over, your seam doesn't end up in the same place. So instead of getting like a big thick bulky seam where the join was because you've done it at a right angle, if you do it at a 45-degree angle, the thickness of that seam runs from there to there, so you get a much flatter finish. I do struggle to explain things sometimes. But anyway, so you don't need it to be bias, but it does help if you do your joins on the bias. So take your fake bias strip, start somewhere in the middle here, and just pop a pin in here. And I'm not going to sew this first sort of 10 centimetres. I'll show you why when I get to the end of it. I'm also not going to pin it. All I'm going to do is I'm going to run down the edge with a 5mm seam allowance, and then when I get to the corner, I'll take it out of the machine and show you how I'm going to mitre it. And I'm going to stop 5mm from the end. So this is the back of your quilt. So where you've got that junction, if you fold this back again at 45 degrees, and then you fold it forward, actually 45 degrees from the very edge, not from where you stopped stitching, from this bit here. And then you fold it back and just pop a pin in there. What you'll have, oh no, I've made a real mess of that for some reason. I know why. Because I stopped 7mm from the end and not 5. Hold on. And normally something like that doesn't make a blind bit of difference to the finish of your work, but if you're trying to get a neat corner on there, so fold it back, fold it forwards again, and pin it. And then sew 5mm in all the way down the other edge. I'll show you how this turns out when I've sewn it. So effectively, because of that mitre, you've actually got a proper corner. So when you take it round to this side, you can mitre your corner in neatly. I know that doesn't look neat at the minute. I've got to turn edges over. But that's what you want. You want to be able to form a tray almost. Now, as luck would have it, my next mitred corner falls right on one of my joins. But we'll do the same thing here. And I'm just going to go and do the other 2 corners. And then I'll come back to you and show you how to do the join. Okay, so I have sewn all of my corners now. And they're all neatly mitered. And then I've stopped here and I've left quite a big gap. And that is quite a big gap, I'll be fair. But the reason I've done that is I've found that actually if you've got a bigger gap, it's a lot easier to manoeuvre. And just typically, that junction, if I'd thought ahead and not sewn this last strip of binding on, I could have done this quite easily. What I want to do is I want to join this fabric, but instead of just joining it, you know, right sides together, sewing it down there and trimming the excess, I want to join it at a right angle. So again, we've still got that nice finish where you don't get a bulky seam. So the best way to do this is to fold up and finger press one side, and then fold down and finger press the other, and just trim off some of your excess there. And then you need to pin it so that you can sew those 2 finger press lines together. And this is why we leave extra room so that you can take it off your mat and you can bend your mat and you can actually get to what you're trying to sew, which is this line here. I don't know if you can see that finger press line. Move that pin away a bit. There you go. And so confident am I that this is correct, I'm just going to trim off the excess in a devil-may-care fashion. And there you've got a perfectly fitting rest of your binding. So we'll just stitch that in place. And then we'll turn it all to the right side of the quilt. Actually, before we do that, you know, like when you turn corners, you normally just snip off the corner. That's exactly what I'm going to do with this quilt. Is just take off those very corners, preferably without snipping the binding. And then bring it up to the top. And then to complete the binding, you make sure that you've pulled it far away from that stitch. And if you fold over and finger press about 5mm on the edge here, and fold it over and make sure you cover that line of stitching that's been formed by sewing it on the back. So it's going to give it about a 1cm border, which would make sense because you've used a 5mm seam, you've got a 3mm wide, no, it's not 3mm wide at all, that would be tiny. You've got a 3cm wide strip, you've used a 5mm seam allowance on the back, you've folded over a 5mm seam allowance here, you've folded it in half, so that's 5 plus 5 is 1cm, 2 centimetres divided by 1, yeah, you've got a 1cm border here. Please forgive me for doing the maths out loud. Sometimes I like to check that I have actually done it right. So I'm just going to pin this edge and then show you how I miter a corner. And then I'm going to pin the rest of it and show you the easiest way I've found of getting a nice accurate top stitch on this. So we've got up as far as the corner. You can still finger press down your 5cm fold. And what I would do, because I'm going to be sewing it in this direction, so in a clockwise direction, I'm going to fold up this bottom edge first and bring down this side in a mitre, just simply so that that fold doesn't get caught under the foot of my sewing machine. And there's no other reason for it than that. That's just personal preference. You can, of course, fold in whichever side you like first. But it just makes the whole sewing much easier. I'm just going to show you again how I did that. Fold over your 5mm. I have a feeling I've said 5cm in the past. I mean 5mm. Around that edge, around that corner of the binding. Lay this flat. Bring this out into a 45-degree triangle and fold it over and lay it flat, so that those two folded edges meet up in that perfect mitre, and then just pin it. So I'm just going to pin the rest of this and then we will top stitch. So I've pinned it all the way round, and I've just got my last corner to mitre. And it's going to be the trickiest corner to mitre because it's right where the joining of my binding was, but hey ho, never mind. Pop a pin in there. So there you go. Now I'm going to break the habit of a lifetime. I'm actually going to change the colour of my thread in my sewing machine. Don't get too excited. Pop a green in there for a change. But I'm going to keep white as the bottom thread because it is just a white backing. And on most sewing machines, you can't see here because the camera's at the wrong angle, you will have a stitch width selector for your zigzag stitch, which is operated, I don't know if you can see that needle moving left and right, it's operated by a dial or an electric operation for the needle position. Now, I want to run a straight stitch, but I want to run it well over to the left. So I'm going to move my needle position well over to the left, and I'm going to use the inside of my foot. Let me just show you. Whereas I normally use this right hand inside as my seam allowance, I'm going to use this left hand inside as my guideline. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it so that the left hand of this binding sits on the left hand. And normally what would happen is as you sew it, you would sew it and your stitching would be here, and you'd have about 3 millimeters between the fold and the stitching. Because I've moved the needle right over to the left, it should run really close to that fold. And it just gives a much neater finish. So here goes nothing. Let's just enlarge that stitch length. And then when you get to your corner, just put your needle in your work, lift your foot and pivot. That mitre on the corner is so small you don't really need to stitch it. It's not going to come unfolded. This border goes on forever. And it's when you're doing this top stitch on the bind that making your joins and your binding on the diagonal really helps, because if you'd done it on a straight edge, you would have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 layers of fabric to try and stitch through at that point. Whereas doing it this way, you are at least taking out about 4 layers each time. No, 2 layers each time. And it means it doesn't get jammed under your foot as well, which is always a bonus. So there you go. One almost perfectly bound quilt. So white stitching on the underside, green stitching on the top, and as you can see, it's run quite close to that folded edge. So it gives a much better finish. One thing I did also mean to say actually on the video before when I was showing you how to quilt your fabric is if you're doing a full-size quilt for a bed and you've only got a domestic sewing machine, you haven't got a long-arm quilter, what you can do, as long as you've got enough table space behind you, is you can roll your quilt up and pin it so that you can actually fit it in this space and quilt. It takes a bit of practice, and especially if you've got a very big and very, very heavy quilt, don't ever lift the foot up unless your needle's in. If you're going to change something, just bear in mind as soon as you lift the foot up, it could just slip out from under your machine. But that's another hint that I meant to say when I showed how to assemble and how to top stitch the layers together. So there you go. I've now got a new mat for my sewing machine. Like so. And hopefully these videos have inspired you to get started on your own quilt, because it really is quite a satisfying hobby, and you know, it is really easy. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoy them all. We will endeavour to put links to the other videos in the description below so you can find all 3 of them. In the meantime, keep safe, keep sewing, and we'll see you soon. If you've been inspired to create, please share your makes with us in the comments section below. And if you've enjoyed videos by the Crafts channel, hit the like button. Want to see more of us? Then click subscribe. See you next time.